According to news sources, mainly through the local Portland Press Herald, Roger Quiron and Brian Garrett, departing Jetport to Logan, connected to another flight for their final destination being Los Angeles and boarded a Delta flight. But they nearly ended up on American Airlines Flight 11 with Atta, Alamari, and the 3 other hijackers crashing into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. But American Airlines was too expensive, so they flew with Delta instead, according to Roger's wife, Tammy Quiron, interviewed in an Associated Press article September 14, 2001. They basically escaped death. They were extremely lucky. But not just because they avoided taking Flight 11, because the plane they embarked for LAX from Logan was Delta 1989.
Security is so tight across the Midwest, passengers on this Delta jet in Cleveland were evacuated, while authorities made sure a threatened bomb was not on board.
Delta 1989 was eventually grounded as all continental and commercial aviation flights were ordered to do so by the FAA, who issued a no-fly ban 1 minute after Flight 175, the second plane struck the South Tower. Delta 1989 was grounded in Cleveland, Ohio at 9:47 a.m., but the story doesn't end there. Typically, as most viewers are familiar with scenes about Flight 93 in the internet blockbuster Loose Change 2nd Edition, Delta 1989 is also briefly mentioned, but not in the context of what's actually known about the Delta flight from Logan. Loose Change not only claims the suggested anomalous-looking crash site of Shanksville was a result of Flight 93 being shot down by early misleading mainstream news reports, Loose Change also still claims that no passenger remains were discovered and that the debris in Shanksville was actually from a different or empty duplicate airliner that was shot down by NORAD, in that Flight 93 actually landed in Cleveland at 10:45 a.m., with all 200 passengers, insinuating the passengers were from all 4 9/11 planes combined on Flight 93, a hypothetical plane swap or switcheroo theory. And then after having landed and being parked in Cleveland, 30 minutes later at 11:15 a.m., the 200 passengers were released from Flight 93 and were brought into a NASA Glenn Research Center at the near west end of the airport, projecting an overall gross theory that the 9/11 hijackings were all hoaxes, where the passengers, instead of being victims, were actually crisis actors in an elaborate shadow government conspiracy, having acted out in making phone calls to loved ones, or in combination thereof, and that the 200 passengers may have also been authentic, but eliminated still after having made phone calls, executed inside a NASA facility. Although this film is not featured around Newark Airport and Flight 93, the intention is not to challenge or address why Loose Change and other filmmakers propagate these hoaxes regarding the hijackings of September 11th. But regarding Delta 1989, Loose Change falsely states that the Delta flight landed at 10:10 a.m., but does accurately tell that Cleveland Hopkins Airport was evacuated and that before Delta 1989 landed, there was already a rumor amiss that a hijacked plane was going to land with a bomb, but Loose Change makes a false assertion that this was mixed up with Flight 93, because there's more about Delta 1989 that's left out, which is ironic because the next segment we're going to show is from a History Channel special, Grounded on 9/11 from 2005, about the stories of air traffic controllers in the US and Canada who were able to successfully ground all commercial air traffic, thousands of planes, right within hours after the 9/11 attacks.
By 9:20, with close to 4,500 flights still over or approaching North America, 2 planes over Cleveland Center are not responding to controller calls. Delta 1989 and United 93 will be listed as the 4th and 5th hijackings of the day, unless controllers can re-establish communication.
Cleveland Center had several aircraft with which they did not have contact, whether they were in the middle of a frequency change, whether they were aircraft that weren't responding to calls, but at one point or another, there were several aircraft airborne that nobody was certain about.
When a pilot crosses from one controller's sector into another, he must switch to the next controller's frequency. During the process, it's not uncommon for dropouts to occur, briefly rendering the plane's radio silent. But on 9/11, dropouts on the 2 planes above Cleveland Center have far more sinister implications. At about 35,000 feet, United 93 and Delta 1989 cross paths. As United 93's radar signal momentarily blinks off, controllers hear someone scream on an errant frequency. But because the caller did not repeat or include a flight ID number, controllers cannot confirm from which plane the call is made.
Somebody call Cleveland. United 1523, did you hear some interference on the frequency here a couple minutes ago, screaming? I did, 797, and we couldn't tell what it was either.
There was confusion in watching the screen. Those planes crossed, and they lost sight of exactly which plane was which. So they had a tremendous number of challenges.
As the FAA and law enforcement started trying to profile, for lack of a better word, the types of aircraft that were involved, heavy jet departures from the East Coast, West Coast destinations, Cleveland Center had stewardship of several of those types of airplanes, including a Delta flight that they immediately suspected might be another potential hijack target.
Besides the planes that hit the towers, Delta 1989 is the only other 767 direct from Boston to LA, departing at 8 a.m. Following the unconfirmed distress call to Cleveland Center, the Delta pilot reports an unruly passenger to his company dispatchers. Suspicions of a hijacking are raised further when he requests an unscheduled landing at Cleveland Airport. The FBI and Cleveland SWAT bring in their heaviest equipment to confront any hijackers.
With the events going on throughout the country, obviously we knew we were under attack. What goes through your mind? At that time, things were happening so quickly, we just had to be focused on the mission we were given to come out to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport to handle a hijacked aircraft.
But it doesn't end there. In comparison to the minimal detail from History Channel's Grounded on 9/11 about unruly passengers on Delta Flight 1989, because according to the Boston Herald, September 19, 2001, underneath the headline, War on Terrorism, 2 more planes possibly targeted on the Day of Terror by Doug Hanchin and Cosmo Mosera Jr., states that sources say at least 1 female passenger reported suspicious behavior by 2 male passengers. Sources say the woman told federal investigators the 2 men appeared nervous as the flight sat on Logan's runway awaiting takeoff. She also said they repeatedly looked around the cabin as they were restless early in the flight, as if they had been looking for others but couldn't find them. But from a much more obscure article from the Massachusetts Wareham Courier on September 20th, 2001, written by Ruth Thompson, who interviewed a female passenger, Mary McFadden, documenting her story with her family, who were originally planning to be on the doomed American Airlines Flight 11 that struck the North Tower, but at last minute she changed her family's flight to Delta 1989 for a lower fee. McFadden said in hindsight there were irregularities during her flight that may, or may not, have had a connection to the terrorism taking place on other planes. There was one man on our plane who would not get off his cell phone, she said. He was speaking in a low, urgent voice. Even when the stewardess went over to him to tell him to turn off the phone, he wouldn't. That's very odd. She also spoke of another passenger who said a man in the seat next to her spooked her because he kept turning his head and looking around throughout the entire flight. It was as though he was waiting for someone, McFadden said. Maybe they were going to hit our plane, but the others didn't show up. I don't know. You think of things. While in flight, McFadden said they were not aware of anything unusual taking place in the world outside their cabin. But then when we had to make an emergency landing, we were told there may be a bomb on the plane or it may be getting hijacked. As you can see, someone else was also just as lucky as passengers Roger Quiron and Brian Garrett, as it seems there very well may have been 3 flights targeted for hijacking out of Boston Logan Airport. That perhaps the intentions of those suspicious Middle Eastern passengers on board Delta 1989 were to hijack the plane accompanied by other potential terrorist hijacking conspirators. But for whatever reason, whether it could have been additional suspects chickening out last minute, or weren't able to board Delta 1989 for some unknown or technical reason, but as far as Logan Airport goes, Delta 1989 isn't the only additional suspected flight. According to BBC News on September 18th, an article titled FBI Probes Attempted 5th Hijack, the article states that another suspected American Airlines plane out of Boston Logan, Flight 43, was an additional target. That the FBI were searching for a number of passengers who were due to fly on American Airlines Flight 43 from Boston, which was grounded due to a mechanical problem. It was scheduled at 8:10 a.m., departure from Boston. So now we're looking at the potential that there were 4 intended hijackings from Boston Logan. However, in the Daily Telegraph on September 20th, in an article titled More Planes May Have Been Targeted, FBI up to 5 other flights on September 11th regarded by FBI as suspicious, that yet another United Airlines flight out of Logan, destined for San Francisco, was suspected by the FBI as a potential target for hijacking. But according to one of the passengers, Janice Burnett, that it may have been spared due to the fact that there were 30 U.S. Marines traveling on it, and that those guys were pretty visible in the boarding area, big and muscular, with the trademark haircuts and duffel bags. And also in the same Boston Herald article mentioned earlier regarding Delta 1989 from September 19th. Meanwhile, a group of Boston area tourists headed to San Francisco on United Airlines Flight 163 earlier that fateful morning said they were informed by airport security personnel in Iowa that their plane may have also been eyed by terrorists. They just told us we were targeted, said passenger Ruth Vana of Malden. That's how they worded it. According to Janice Burnett, a tour guide with the Milford-based Scout Tours, who was on the flight, security workers at the Des Moines airport where the plane was forced to land told passengers that the FBI discovered information on their flight in a car believed to belong to the terrorists. The car, a rental that was left at Logan, was towed away and impounded by the FBI last week.